from New Milford, Connecticut. Martha, welcome.
Good evening. Human population growth has more than doubled in the past 50 years. The planet cannot sustain this growth. I realize this is a poisonous topic for politicians, but it's crucial to face. Empowering women and educating everyone on the need to curb population growth seems a reasonable campaign to enact. Would you be courageous enough to discuss this issue and make it a key feature of a plan to address climate catastrophe?
Well, Martha, the answer is yes. And the answer has everything to do with the fact that women in the United States of America, by the way, have a right to control their own bodies and make reproductive decisions. And the Mexico City Agreement, which denies American aid to those organizations around the world that allow women to have abortions or even get involved in birth control, to me is totally absurd. So I think, especially in poor countries around the world, where women do not necessarily want to have large numbers of babies, and where they can have the opportunity through birth control to control the number of kids they have, something I very, very strongly support.
I want to introduce.
So there was a funny little controversy this week because Bernie Sanders was asked a question about overpopulation and the challenge that presents in the developing world. And he spoke honestly about the fact that he thinks it is a problem and that the solution would be basically to bring in birth control and abortion and liberalize these societies. Basically an acknowledgement that this system of global homo of neoliberalism has an effect of driving down birth rates, and that once that spreads to the developing world, overpopulation will become less of a problem. Now, what was funny about this was the way I saw this was some of these conservative media outlets were sharing this, saying that this was the most horrifying thing imaginable and that Bernie Sanders was such a morally reprehensible figure to even suggest this. And this is really a typical reactionary conservative attitude to things, where whenever someone on the left presents an alternative vision of the way things are going, or presents a positive action that could be taken to influence the world, the conservatives will get up in arms and either call them communists and compare it to Stalinism because they want to do something that involves planning the economy, or else just call them Hitler and compare them to the Nazis because they want some kind of policy that influences demographics or people's personal lives. But ultimately, Bernie Sanders is right on this. There is an overpopulation problem. Whatever way you try and square it, whether you believe in climate change or not, there are many other metrics you can look at to show that the world is overpopulated. And on current projections, by 2050, the world's population will be over 11 billion. And that's at a time when European population is falling, South America is pretty much stagnant. And so all this population growth is coming from the developing world. There will be 1 billion extra Africans by 2050. Nigeria's population is scheduled to double. And no one is talking about this, and no one is allowed to talk about this. And when someone does talk about it, they get called a Nazi, and they're the most morally reprehensible figure imaginable. And this gets at the heart of the problem of conservatism, which is that conservatives totally ignore structural issues. And in a sense, their entire worldview is built around the idea that structural issues are some kind of an illusion. That, as Thatcher said, society doesn't exist, and that ultimately there is no sum of society that's greater than its individual parts. All there is the individual parts. And to try and influence the structure, or to try and have a positive impact on those individual people's lives through tackling structural issues, well, that's just a form of statism, socialism, and that's the moral evil. But ultimately, what this ignores is that inaction is a form of action in a societal matrix as complex as the one we currently inhabit. Because if you say, well, we're not going to influence demographics or birth rates because that's evil and that's statism and ultimately it's all up to individual choices, what's going to happen is the people that don't think much about the future and have a lot of children and are less likely to use birth control, they're the ones that will ultimately inhabit the world. It's like the same argument that can be used against pacifism. You know, if you want to be a pacifist for whatever idealistic reasons, ultimately in a world of pacifists, the one guy with a sword, the one guy that's perhaps the least moral of everyone in that world, of all the pacifists, is going to be the one that seizes power. And in a world approached the way the Conservatives approach it, where we can't talk about population or demographics or birth rates, what's going to happen is the high IQ people that buy into this kind of conservative, idealistic view of the world and pursue their own individualistic lives and careers and stop having children, they'll be at a disadvantage to the people who think more tribally and instinctively on these issues. And so I think another reason that the Conservatives get so annoyed when someone like Bernie Sanders talks about something like this is he's pointing out a fact that they like to ignore, which is that things like birth control, feminism, liberalism, they do have the effect of driving down birth rates, and that's a consequence of them that is necessary. You can't have one without the other. And of course, Conservatives, because they portray themselves as being pro-family and they like to associate their worldview with this kind of traditionalist Christian view of things, with the nuclear family, happy European people with 5 children, that ultimately that really isn't compatible anymore with this advanced system of neoliberalism and everything it brings with it, the entire social agenda that's now part and parcel of the economic progress associated with it. And of course, Conservatives want to ignore that because since people like Thatcher and Reagan, free market economics and neoliberalism has been so closely wedded to this conservative social outlook within their political philosophy. And at the heart of that, there is a contradiction. The two are fundamentally irreconcilable. But the Conservative has to ignore this because they've built an entire worldview on the facade that these two go hand in hand. Whereas when you just look at it objectively, there's no reason why they should. In fact, you see that the two are really opposed to each other. And what you see in the Western world is that the economics always win out on the social stuff. And so the Conservatives don't want to talk about something like demographics or population control because ultimately they, through their inaction, are surrendering the control of those structural issues to other forces. One of the forces that they surrender it to is the left. And the left, their approach to this is the Bernie Sanders approach. It's this form of bio-Leninism where hordes of the third world are imported and feminism is instituted, and this kind of intersectionalist neo-Bolshevism is instituted in the superstructure, which leads to a kind of biological warfare against the people that were previously the cultural hegemons, who they perceive as the enemy, namely Christian white males, and that traditional form of European society. But the other actor that Conservatives surrender this social agenda to by their inaction is the capitalists. And they're very happy for that to happen. And the economic progress that they herald, what does it actually lead to? It leads to falling birth rates. It leads to high IQ women going to college and taking up careers and not having children, and leaving a class of kind of low IQ lumpen proletariat to reproduce and live off the sustenance of social welfare, while at the same time these capitalists can import third worlders if they need more labour. And so when you leave decisions regarding demographics, regarding biopower, when you leave the biopower to the capitalists, their answer is to take your best, to ultimately cost them the opportunity to reproduce, and then to outsource reproduction to the third world, which isn't developed, so it isn't costing them anything, and turn it into that. And they turn the third world into a kind of human production factory. You know, much like they'll outsource manufacturing, they'll outsource the production of humanity itself, and then they have this mass of labourers that they can easily import without losing any of their current stock of labour to something like maternity leave. And so these two visions of the world, whether it's the bio-Leninism of the left or this very cold, quantitative approach to biopower that the capitalists are taking, these are two morally vacuous visions of the world. And they're only allowed to succeed because they masquerade as being a lack of biopower, because people don't look at things structurally. They don't see it as the capitalists choosing to lower Western birth rates while importing their labour from elsewhere. It's just a mass of individualist choices, and the capitalists themselves are individualists. And the same with the left. They'll present it as feminism and birth control and abortion being personal choices, and they'll ignore the biopolitical aspects of this and what it does to things like demographics or population or IQ. And so in all of this, you're only ever allowed to present a positive approach to biopower and biopolitics if it's masquerading as a negative approach, that is the rejection of any kind of meta-narrative or greater good informing your approach to biopolitics. And I actually think this rejection of biopolitics and the reduction of everything to the individual, but this specific rejection of biopower and biopolitics is one of the fundamental characteristics of postmodernity, and one of the ways personally I would define postmodernity. And I think this goes back to the Holocaust and the narrative that's been built around that. Because funnily enough, this week as well as this news of Bernie Sanders wanting eugenics, there was an article going around where there was a preview screening of a new Holocaust film, The Painted Bird. And apparently audience members fought each other in order to escape the preview showing of this, because it's so gruesome. It contains scenes, quote, of brutal incest, bestiality, rape and mutilation. And of course critics are hailing this as a masterpiece. And I saw Morgoth retweeted this, and he said that the more distant the Holocaust becomes, the harder the propaganda around it has to work. It used to be just chimneys, smoke and trains. Now it's Texas chainsaw, tear, gore, bestiality and weird sex torture snuff. And there's something fundamentally true about this, which is that the entire project of postmodernity is built around and informed by the narrative of the Holocaust. Because the fundamental narrative of the Holocaust is that when people behave in an ethnocentric fashion, and when people organise collectively for the good of their nation or race, that inevitably leads to violence and ultimately genocide against an other. But there's also a more implicit and perhaps more fundamental narrative informing this, which is that when people unite around or believe in any concept of a greater good, a meta-narrative, and are willing to self-sacrifice for that, that ultimately can lead to and justify great violence. And postmodernity is characterized by the rejection of the meta-narrative. And for many postmodern theorists, the fundamental exemplification of the meta-narrative was the Holocaust, was the National Socialist German project. Hitler was the great purveyor of the meta-narrative of, the greater German Reich, Germany finding its place in the world. And for them, the result of that is violence and persecution of the other. And it's interesting that one of the primary theorists of postmodernity was a Polish Jew called Zygmunt Bauman, and he wrote a book called Holocaust and Modernity. And there's an interesting passage I've picked out here, which I think captures this attitude of the postmodernists, this skepticism to biopower and the fear that biopower could be wielded in service of a meta-narrative, and specifically in the service of a meta-narrative that is informed by people coming together in their own interests, in a kind of idealistic nationalism. And it's obvious why people like Bauman specifically would fear and be opposed to this kind of collective idealism. And so it's no surprise that postmodernity was very much informed by people like Bauman. So just to read this passage from the Holocaust and Modernity, Bauman writes, "Invariably, there is an aesthetic dimension to the design. The ideal world about to be built conforms to the standards of superior beauty. Once built, it will be richly satisfying, like a perfect work of art. This is a gardener's vision, projected upon a world-sized screen. Some gardeners hate the weeds that spoil their design, that ugliness in the midst of beauty, litter in the midst of serene order. Some others are quite unemotional about them, just a problem to be solved, an extra job to be done. Not that it makes a difference to the weeds. Both gardeners exterminate them. If asked or given a chance to pause and ponder, both would agree weeds must die not so much because of what they are as because of what the beautiful, orderly garden ought to be. Stalin's and Hitler's victims were not killed in order to capture and colonize the territory they occupied. Often they were killed in a dull, mechanical fashion with no human emotions, hatred included, to enliven it. They were killed because they did not fit, for one reason or another, the scheme of a perfect society. Their killing was not the work of destruction, but creation. They were eliminated so that an objectively better world, more efficient, more moral, more beautiful, could be established. A communist world or a racially pure Aryan world. In both cases, a harmonious world, conflict-free, docile in the hands of their rulers. Orderly, controlled. People tainted with ineradicable blight of their past or origin could not be fitted into such an unblemished, healthy and shining world. Like weeds, their nature could not be changed, they had to be eliminated. The more rational is the organization of action, the easier it is to cause suffering and remain at peace with oneself. So there's a couple of interesting things about this passage, which is from a text that very much informs postmodernity. And one is the rejection of rationality and the old modernist kind of valorizing of reason as the great driver of progress. And you see here that ultimately the postmodernists, in a sense, need to reject the category of reason in order to ensure this protected status for people that Bauman is concerned about. And he speaks disparagingly of an aesthetic approach to politics and the fact that people like Stalin and Hitler had an aesthetic view of the world. And another thing you see in postmodernity is the complete rejection of traditional standards of beauty and a rejection of the concept of beauty itself. And it's also interesting that he mentioned Stalin and Hitler in the same sentence, because after Stalin came to power and liquidated many of the old cosmopolitan elements of the Communist Party, people like Bauman came to reject communism and fascism together, and instead promote this kind of vaguely anarchistic liberalism informed by moral relativism and nihilism. And so Stalinism and Hitlerism both fall under the category of this modernist statism that is ultimately evil, because it presents an aesthetic vision of the world, and because any aesthetic vision of the world, in declaring something to be beautiful, also declares its inverse to be ugly. And so you see that the very potential for value judgments itself is what Bauman and the postmodernists are railing against, because in that world, the behaviours of certain people that aren't beneficial to the collective, to the cohesiveness of society, those people can be singled out and targeted, and the collective can come together using these old categories of goodness, of beauty, of aesthetics, and make a better world. And for Bauman and the postmodernists, this inevitably leads to the Holocaust and to the greatest moral evil of all, the elimination of minority peoples that don't fit in this aesthetic vision of the world. And so what's necessary is a complete deconstruction and destruction of these old concepts like reason and beauty and goodness. And the approach to politics has to turn from one that is structural and collective and idealistic to one that is nihilistic, relativistic and individualistic. And that now is what both conservatism and leftism has become. And this kind of conservatism that starts sounding the whistle whenever they see anyone talking in a structural way or talking about a positive vision of society, they're very much a result of this postmodernist approach to politics propounded by people like Bauman in the interests of Bauman's own people. They're very much fallen into that category, and it further reinforces the obvious truth that conservatives are allies to no one now, except people like Bauman and the capitalists that continue to benefit from the erosion of civil society. And as long as they and the right sit on the sidelines and don't present a positive aesthetic vision of the world, what's going to fill that vacuum that people clearly desire now? They clearly desire an authentic, idealistic approach to politics. What's going to fill that gap is people like the radical left and like the climate campaigner Greta Thunberg, these kind of manufactured dissidents that are created by the system to present a utopian vision that ultimately conforms to exactly the direction that the real planners, the capitalist oligarchs, want to go in. And that's why conservatism is completely failing our people and needs to die as soon as possible. But I think it's interesting. I think their reaction to this clip from Bernie Sanders, I think it says a lot about their core ideology and this constant reinforcement of the Holocaust narrative. These two things definitely go hand in hand, and they both have something in common: the constant propaganda around the Holocaust and the conservative view of the world. They both basically exist for the same reason, and that is to prevent another Stalin or Hitler, another person uniting people around an aesthetic vision of the world.